Okay, hello, good everyone, and thank you for joining us for this virtual session. This is our first distance presentation. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Steve Harvey with a paper titled King to God, the Divine Oracle of Ahmose at Abydos. So without further ado, please, Dr. Harvey, you can share your screen and begin.
Great. Thank you, James. Nice to see you. Nice to see everybody out there. Just give me 1 second as I share. Okay. This was working easily before. Now, there we go. And I hope that's going to be okay. So I'm going to assume that everyone can see my screen, and I hope someone will jump in with audio if they cannot, because I have no way of otherwise knowing that you can see what I'm talking about. So what I want to talk to you about today, and my computer is freezing. Okay. What I want to talk to you about today is the cult of Ahmose at Abydos, a topic I've talked about a lot since 1993. And one thing I want to begin by saying is a particularly noticeable feature of the ancestor cults at Thebes is the lack of presence of the veneration of Nebpehtyre Ahmose, who's the founder of the 18th dynasty and of the entire era, the New Kingdom. And he was, of course, recognized in ancient times as a kind of generational founder. So what's interesting is when we usually look at royal cults, we look at Thebes, and we ask the question, how do the cults of deified ancestral kings and queens come about? But in fact, Thebes is not ideal for considering this issue in Dynasty 18, since the temples and foundations of these ancestral rulers, Ahmose, his wife Ahmose Nefertari, for example, and certainly Amenhotep I, are not especially informative at Thebes when they're identified at all, and that includes the royal burials. So in my view, Theban cults of Ahmose Nefertari, as we see here in the Deir el-Medina tomb, and her son Amenhotep I, represent a return of focus to the Thebes after the death of Ahmose. And accordingly, that is a different slice of time than we see at Abydos. At Abydos, we see the celebration of Ahmose and his wife, Ahmose Nefertari, contemporary with their reign, and possibly their son, Ahmose Ankh, or maybe even Ahmose Sapair, depending on how we identify that child, deified prince. As founders of the 18th dynasty, they're celebrated at Abydos. So I'm going to turn and really primarily look at Abydos, but I want to take this table from Yasmin Nashazli's Royal Ancestor Worship book to just contrast for us visually the relatively few representations of Ahmose I, only 5 examples here in Theban tombs, as opposed to the maybe 47, 48 known for Ahmose Nefertari and Amenhotep I, to remind us that the Theban cult of Ahmose is almost non-existent. And indeed, Ahmose's cults extend beyond just Abydos. Recently, Tomasz Bach published this fascinating stela found at Giza in the area of ancient Rosatau, an area that by its very name for Egyptologists is redolent with the cult of Osiris. And here we see deified pharaoh Ahmose during the reign of Ramses the Great, so some 300 years after his death, behind Isis. And he's being approached by the Queen Mother Tuya, and then the 2 figures Tia and Tia, relatives of Ramses the Great. But what we want to focus on here is that the cult of Ahmose may not be well attested at Thebes, but it certainly does have legs. It does have importance elsewhere. Now, in the article by Bach, which was published in 2008, he quoted me, and he quoted my work 20 years before in my dissertation. And I apparently made some statements that I want to now revisit and look at again. So 2 quotes he puts forward that I said at that point very firmly. The recognition of Ahmose at Abydos as a local god was not a feature put in place by the king at the founding of the cult, but was a spontaneous innovation in response to local interests and beliefs. I then went on to say, and he quoted, the Oracle of Ahmose was a spontaneous later manifestation of a popular cult, rather than an aspect which was instituted at the behest of the ruler himself or his son, Amenhotep I. So I want to ask myself, and I'm asking you, to what extent is this supported by the evidence? So, in fact, what we can do, and with more time that's gone on and more time that I've thought about this in the almost 30 years I've been working at South Abydos on the Ahmose monuments, we can look at royal agency, the different way that royals figure in the Ahmose cult. And here's a brief timeline from 1550 to about 1200. So there's the initial founding under Ahmose and his wife Ahmose Nefertari of the cult and the pyramid complex, which I'll mention briefly, but we're not going to explore architecturally in depth. There's then a founding by Amenhotep I, and we'll talk about this later, of the chapel to Osiris and Khentiamentu, and to the deified Ahmose and North Abydos. So there's two different stages in the beginning of the 18th dynasty. Then there's a renovation of the Ahmose cult under Thutmose III by a high priest of Osiris named Nebpehtyre. Then the presumed closure of this and all divine cults other than the Aten under Akhenaten. And then good evidence for the restoration of the Ahmose cult under Tutankhamun, or one of the pharaohs just after Akhenaten. Then the commission of statues of Ahmose Nefertari, for which I found archaeological evidence under Ramses II by the high priest of Osiris Wennefer, who is well known into the reign of Ramses the Great. And then in the temple of Ramses II, and possibly in Seti, the first famous temple at Abydos, barque shrines for the barques of Ahmose and Ahmose Nefertari, processional barques for these deities placed within the divine temples of the rulers, Seti I and his son Ramses the Great, and then even possibly an expansion in the Ramesside period to include young princes of the Ahmoside line at Abydos. The first thing that, of course, we want to point out, and I think this is a fine point that we really want to indicate, is that the ancestor cults at Abydos begin under Ahmose himself, honoring his own grandmother, Tetisheri, who was not buried at Abydos. And the text here, the stela found by Corelli in 1902 inside the pyramid of Tetisheri, clearly establishes that this was not her burial place, but was a memorial to her, and was made in honor of her by Ahmose and Ahmose Nefertari together. And the text goes on to establish a religious endowment, something very similar in the more recent times, in modern days, to Islamic waqf endowments, or awqaf, that are essentially charitable endowments set up for perpetuating structures, but which have also important implications for economy and architecture and the life and economic life of the community surrounding it. So now I want to ask, what forms did Ahmose's cult images take at Abydos? Can we differentiate these based on their representations? And I think we can. I'll do that today. How did these images of Ahmose move across the Abydos landscape? And thirdly, when and in what formats and what contexts did they form part of processions? To do this, I want to first look at the stela of Nebpehtyre I mentioned, of Thutmose III's reign. And here in this translation, Elizabeth Froude gives us some of the text. Nebpehtyre says, "The person of my lord favored me. I was appointed the chief speaker of Khamenu," which is the name for the Ahmose pyramid complex, "in order to sanctify the domain of his father, the dual king Nebpehtyre. His treasuries were under my seal, and I came out from there prosperous and flourishing up to 9 years." And then, importantly, says, "I directed the work on the Neshmet barque, the sacred barque of Osiris, and repulsed the one who repelled against its person." That is to say, he was in charge of the processions going out from the Osiris temple of the Osiris barque, the Neshmet barque, in addition to his roles with Ahmose. So that accounts for two things. One, royal agency in the person of Thutmose III indicating that this should happen. And secondly, the initiative taken by the Osiris priest, Nebpehtyre, to make sure it happens, and perhaps even a personal interest in the cult of Ahmose specifically. So how can we account for the balance between royal agency? We've seen it with Ahmose starting up Tetisheri's cult, with Thutmose III furthering Ahmose's cult in his reign, versus non-royal or popular agency. And one possible way, of course, is through excavation to see simpler forms of cultic items, mud and clay figurines like the one excavated at South Abydos here, female figurine, ritual vessels, traces of cult activity, as well as votives made in non-formal styles or materials. So here, for example, from the Corelli excavations in 1902, a pregnant female statuette with taweret, very typical of private cults, domestic cult, or non-formal religion in Egypt, such as at Amarna and elsewhere, Deir el-Medina certainly as well. But here we have it in the Ahmose town at Abydos. And on the right here, some anapigraphic and epigraphic carvings that give us an idea for folk art, essentially folk cult. The one on the top may be a funerary memorial, and the one below showing at least Ptah and maybe Ahmose as well, possibly. And the reason I suggest that is in Manchester Museum, from excavations in the Pyramid Temple of Ahmose made by Mace in 1900, this unpublished fragment of Ahmose on the right and Ptah Neferher, beautiful of face, on the left. And so we see a very non-formal stela, could have been carved by a non-artist, really, a kind of an untrained artisan in the community during the 18th dynasty, most likely. We also see the impact of sealings, the impressions of scarab seals made in wet clay. And here, for example, in reflecting the interest during the time of Thutmose III, we see multiple impressions of the same sealing of Thutmose III we found in a granary in the Ahmose town area, and in the Ahmose an impression of a seal of Thutmose III. So we might see actually the physical opening and closing of boxes and doors by these officials in the reigns of the 18th dynasty. Then I want to turn and look at what the forms are of the particular manifestation of Ahmose's cult. And the first one is the famous one that you'll probably already know about, the shrouded image of Ahmose in a barque being carried and providing an oracle. And this is dated to 2 Akhet 25, the specific day, apparently at Abydos, of an Ahmose festival, maybe the accession date of the king, we could guess. This is a stela first published in 1917 by Legrand. And here we see it, priests during the reign of Ramses II, year 14 of that pharaoh, carrying Pharaoh Ahmose and the king on the prow and the stern, and it has a small figure of Ahmose Nefertari praying to the shrouded figure of Ahmose. So we don't know what his statue within looked like. All we know is that an oracular decree was made during the course of this procession in year 14, second month of Akhet, day 25 of Ramses the Great. And here we see the text published by Froude, describing that the Wab priest Passer approached with other priests of Ahmose to the barque of Ahmose and put a complaint about fields. And they ask a question: does this field belong to Chai, the son of Sejemenef? The god did not agree with that. Then he said, does it belong to the Wab priest Passer, the son of Mose? And the god agreed emphatically. And that means that an oracular decree was somehow noted at this point. And for a sense of what the mechanics are of this kind of oracular procession, we of course turn to Deir el-Medina, where the evidence not of Ahmose's oracle, but of Amenhotep I is very, very strong. And from that, from the work of Czerny and others, we understand that barques were seen to bow in one direction or another under the weight of the shoulders of the priests in this ancient procession that, of course, reminds us, as we've just seen Liz Wickett's film, of the Mulid of Abu al-Hagag at Luxor and many other more modern processions I'll mention again in a moment. Now, interestingly, the Wab priest of the Wab priest of Ahmose, is known also from a Shabti found by Corelli's excavations of a private cemetery. And this private cemetery is to the immediate east of Ahmose's pyramid. The Shabti's here now in the British Museum, and some artifacts of Thutmose III's reign as well in this image. Now, what's interesting is that the talk by Janet Richards this morning, which mentioned the Sheikh Mohammed shrine near Ahmose's pyramid, is very much relevant because these objects I'm showing on the screen right now were found at the base of the shrine of Sheikh Mohammed. And in fact, in Corelli's account, Abydos 3, published in 1904, he describes that the little cemetery is very near a modern Arab one. And between the two stands a rather large white sheikh's tomb. That's the Sheikh Mohammed's tomb we heard about earlier from Muhammad Abu Yazid and Ayman Damarani, as interpreted through Janet Richards. As it says here, this is greatly venerated by the fellahin, the villagers, who come in considerable numbers to kiss the four uprights of the wooden box-like cenotaph that stands in the middle of the tomb. I noticed that in walking around it, they always keep to the right side of the cenotaph, and that a small boy was corrected for going the other way. Great care is taken not to violate anything held in any way sacred, so our men had been told how close to the tomb they were to dig, and no matter how promising a pit happened to be, it might not be pushed any nearer. But, of course, the villagers did not know this, and for a few days I noticed considerable nervousness. There evidently was a fear lest we should dig right under the sheikh's tomb or even pull it down. And just as we had exhausted the cemetery, including the Payiri Shabti, a select deputation of the biggest men of the district armed with clubs came up to ask us to stop. So this is a reminder that, in fact, colonial European excavators were not particularly sensitive to the more modern meanings of the site. But what is fascinating is that this very thing, the processions in ancient time, are in many ways still being replicated today in and around the shrine of Sheikh Mohammed at South Abydos. And in fact, in 1993, in the course of my first season of excavation, Marianne Pols-Wegner was one of the team members and witnessed a funeral where the local person, a local important person, was being carried, and the villagers started running and sending up enormous amounts of dust, and then stopping and sitting and feeling they couldn't go any further. And in fact, funerary processions like this are often said to reflect ancient Egyptian oracular practice. And this is a fascinating survival, echoes across 3,500 years. And here we don't see that actual procession that of Ahmose in the vicinity of the Ahmose site, but this is actually the burial of another Egyptian saint, Omar Sharif. I couldn't find a better photograph of an Egyptian funeral procession. Now, interestingly, in 1917, Le Grand, when he was publishing the Ahmose Oracle Stela, put forth this document from 1916 about a relative of Abu al-Haggag, which relates very much to what Janet was talking about this morning, as well as to Liz Wickett's film. What we hear is that people experienced weight, that they were carrying the sheikh on their shoulders, and we felt right away that the bier got heavy. None of us could walk. And after reciting the Fatiha, they picked it up, they felt nothing, but then again, they felt the weight of the sheikh. No one could walk because the sheikh weighed us down in the bier. And I put up the Arabic with the witness document there just to kind of give a sense of this continuity. So looking across that perspective, we can then see that there probably was a barque procession of Ahmose in 2 Akhet 25, maybe the accession date of the pharaoh, which parallels the Ahmose Nefertari feast at Deir Medina, called the Sailing of Nefertari, which happened in a different month and a different day, and perhaps paralleled festivals that we know about from Amenhotep I. And then, of course, I'll come to and mention later the Koyak festival, the Osiris festival in the 4th month of Akhet, the eponymous month of the festival. Now, through excavation at the Ahmose pyramid site in 1899, Mace found in 1900, Mace found this stela, which implies the restoration of Ahmose's cult, and of course Amun-Ra's, locally following the closure of these cults under Akhenaten. And this figure, very much in post-Amarna style, whose name has been hacked out, is probably Tutankhamun, in my opinion, maybe I. And we see behind him not the living pharaoh Ahmose, of course, but the divinized form in complete regalia with his sporen, the Heka scepter of kingship, the flail, and also this rather wonderful solar crown with ram's horns. And behind him, Ahmose Nefertari, his wife, also perhaps divinized at South Abydos. Now, what was the nature of this barque procession? Well, I can't go into it in great detail, but we know it initiated probably at Ahmose's pyramid complex. It would have gone past the Ramesside tombs, which Kevin Cahill has excavated in recent years in the area called the Temple Cemetery at the edge of the Ahmose town. So it would have gone through the village in the same way that Amenhotep I barques went through the village of Deir el-Medina. It would have gone to stop in the temple of Seti I and Ramses II, and there's good inscriptional evidence for this, as developed by Catherine Eaton and Ogden Gillette and other scholars. And then it would have gone on perhaps to the Osiris temple, and then maybe to Gab, the tombs of the First Dynasty and Second Dynasty rulers, but also the notional Osiris tomb. So we have some idea of the processional route. But there's another form of Ahmose's oracle, perhaps. And I am suspecting this, I'm calling it Form 2 here, as a revealed image of seated Ahmose in a carrying chair, in part based on this fragment that we found in the temple of Ahmose Nefertari in recent years. Now, this temple, Temple C, is specifically associated with Ahmose Nefertari in inscription and in bricks. It's built during the reign of Ahmose, but towards the end of it, after the Hyksos have been defeated and Egypt has been reunited. And here we see the first ever in Egyptian art representation of a priest standing with a fan below the processional image of the pharaoh. And we can turn to Gebel Silsila and see, perhaps from the reign of Hatshepsut originally, but then recarved by Horemheb, an image of the pharaoh in procession, or a statue rather, of the pharaoh in procession, with a similar fan bearer below. And of course, we can parallel this with oracular processions of Amenhotep I at Deir el-Medina and other places at Thebes. And so we can perhaps ask that there was, or ask if there was a processional similar carrying chair image of Ahmose sent around at Abydos, also perhaps subject to an oracle. Now, Form 3 is another one that I've now come to think of as being essentially contemporaneous with the reign of Ahmose, because it's first attested in the chapel of Amenhotep I, where the deified Ahmose is depicted for the first time. And possibly this was also part of a statue procession with evidence for emplacements both at South Abydos and at North Abydos, which I'll show you in a moment. North Abydos, Petrie excavated starting in about 1900, the chapel of Amenhotep I and Ahmose. Here you see within other 18th dynasty structures. This was open and still standing and well, obviously visited into the Ramesside period. We can look there and see reliefs of Amenhotep I in all of these cases facing Osiris, but then very importantly here on the right, the mummified form of Ahmose. And he's very clearly indicated, named, and most likely this is Nebpehtyre Ahmose, his father, as would make every bit of sense. Now, interestingly, when we look at the plan of this structure, which is fronted by pillars and has a small pillared hall, there's a sanctuary in the back with what I think could be a possible emplacement for a processional image, and perhaps that mummiform image of Ahmose. And there's evidence at South Abydos, perhaps, for the same kind of mummiform image of Ahmose. In this pillar fragment, there's two faces of a pillar fragment, this one showing probably Ahmose Nefertari, based on context. And here, I first identified it as Osiris Ptah, based on this very unusual falcon-headed counterpoise of the collar. But I think, in fact, it may well be mummiform Ahmose based on the parallel to the representation at North Abydos. And if so, this would make another terminus for the mummiform image of Ahmose, possibly. Now, fascinatingly, Corelli in 1902, after he found, was nearly beaten to death trying to dig by the shrine of Sheikh Muhammad and found the tomb of Payiri and these other things, he went on to find a terrace temple also built by Ahmose, and this is at South Abydos as well, a kilometer away from the pyramid of Ahmose, and 2.5 kilometers away from the shrine of Amenhotep I. But in it, past a series of circuitous rooms, at the end, again, at the cult's destination, the innermost part, is a 15-centimeter high stone dais, which he said was very carefully cut. And again, I think perhaps a terminus of a processional cult. And it's not big enough, I don't think, for a barque. So I'm thinking here maybe the mummiform figure of Ahmose, already created in his lifetime, perpetuated by his son, Amenhotep I, and essentially contemporaneous with the beginning of the dynasty, which is something we don't see at all, as far as I know, or in any evidence we have at Deir el-Medina or anywhere at Thebes. So then we might see a procession going between the terrace temple, the Ahmose pyramid area where that pillar fragment came from, and the Amenhotep I chapel, a different processional route with a processional image in a carrying chair, maybe, or perhaps just the mummiform image exposed to view, like in the Min Festival scenes we see at Thebes. And just to remind you, there are, in fact, mummiform deified Amenhotep I images at Thebes, certainly known at Deir el-Bahari. And perhaps this gives us an idea of what one of these mummiform images of Ahmose would have looked like, though perhaps in a lighter weight material like wood, not preserved. And here from Sai Island in Sudan, Amenhotep I in his said festival garment. And I just want to mention that, of course, these are not Osirid images. They're not about Osiris. They're primarily about the said festival, the festival of rejuvenation, the eternal life of the pharaoh, and the eternal protection of the pharaoh from evil elements. Now, that leads me to the key question: did the processional aspect that we see established under Ramses the Great as an oracle begin under the reign of Ahmose, or perhaps Amenhotep I? And we can leave that question open. There is evidence for seated images of Ahmose at Abydos, here in a stela that is certainly from Abydos, published by Monroe in 1988 in the Kessler Museum. And we see here individuals praying in the reign of Ramses II into Merneptah to Ahmose, Nefertari, and Amenhotep I in these seated kind of images. Now, the fourth form are standing statues of Ahmose, which are not independently either part of Ahmose's own barque or carried in his own procession, but rather accompany the Neshmet barque of Osiris in processions from the Osiris precinct to Poker, El Gab, the notional burial place of Osiris. So how would we have evidence for these? A stela in Marseille is very interesting because, certainly from Abydos, it shows a high priest here praying to the Neshmet barque. It's a different kind of a barque than the Ahmose barque. We see it doesn't have human-headed ends. Rather, it's the classic Neshmet, and it contains within it Osiris and Isis, Horus, Anubis, Wepwawet here, the opener of the ways. But these two figures at the prow are actually Ahmose in two different forms. So we can ask, do Ahmose and Ahmose Nefertari processions at Abydos perhaps interact with broader Osiris festivals like the Koyak festival, just as the cult of deified royals at Thebes, Amenhotep I and Ahmose Nefertari, clearly relate to the beautiful festival of the valley. So how do these individual festivals of a king or a royal interact with local religious processions that are of broader significance? Statues of Ahmose from this evidence, from this stela, seem to have been loaded onto the Neshmet barque for the processions that I mentioned. And here we just see a detail with the two figures, one labeled the good god Nebpehtyre, and then the other, and he's wearing the Nemes headdress, and the other with the Ibis wig, Uraeus, and boatman's circlet, the son of Re Ahmose. Two forms, both perhaps wooden statues. And just to enforce that Ahmose has some role with the Neshmet barque, there is this 19th dynasty stela now in Lyon, which shows and named Osiris, Isis, and Ahmose and here the smaller, perhaps, barque of the pharaoh in the center of, or in the context of, the much larger and more important Neshmet barque, which you'll remember also was part of the connection that Nebpehtyre established under Thutmose III between the Neshmet barque as the broader concern and Ahmose's cult as a smaller concern. So for this procession, we certainly know the key element of the Neshmet barque's procession is a kind of essential going out of Osiris complex and going through the sacred wadi to El Ga'ab, but through the connection to Ahmose, we can at least imagine these statues making some kind of procession and going to join the Neshmet at the Osiris temple. The final kind of element that I think we can see from my archaeological work at Abydos is an expansion in Dynasty 19 beyond just Ahmose's cult, these proliferation of forms perhaps, but to include royal sons. And this is based on two stela fragments I found in past years in contexts that seem to be more related to Ahmose Nefertari. Here, a row of royals of the early 18th dynasty, although we don't have their names, we can guess based on context that it's Ahmose Nefertari here, followed by a prince. And the sidelock is clear, the lotus is clear that this is an effective spirit. Same thing here, a sidelock of youth, a lotus curling up. What we may be looking at, in fact, are processional groups of, or I should say, religious groups in stelae. And here's another stela of a king, maybe Ahmose, and a queen, Ahmose Nefertari, similar to the Kessner Museum example we already mentioned. And this gives us an idea that perhaps there was, in fact, at Abydos, a cult of this prince. I'd like to say it's Ahmose Sapphire. I think it's the son who appears on the donation stela of Ahmose, where his child is shown called Ahmose Ankh, or Ahmose the Living, and who is called the eldest son of the pharaoh, but we know he doesn't succeed Ahmose, that he dies, and instead Amenhotep I comes to the throne. So this prince had a special value as a would-be heir and child of Ahmose Nefertari, the first god's wife of Amun. And we'll hear more about Ahmose Sapphire from another speaker later. So this really just brings me to say that many monuments that are previously thought by other scholars to be from Thebes often are misconstrued and are actually from Abydos. This is a very good example of one that sometimes is taken to be part of the early 18th dynasty royal cults at Thebes, but is absolutely, completely found at Abydos and relates to Abydos deeply through these officials, such as the mayor of the local town of Thebes, Satep Ihu, whose statue is also known from Abydos, the D cemetery. And here we see Ahmose Nefertari and Prince Ahmose. It's not Amenhotep I ever, in an important sense. It's not Amenhotep I and his mother. It's rather Ahmose, Ahmose's wife, Ahmose Nefertari, and their deceased child, who are particularly important at this site. So I hope I've given you some idea of how Abydos forms a kind of a parallel to Theban cults, but also allows us a completely insight into royal cults and divinization in the New Kingdom.
That's fantastic. As always, Dr. Harvey, a phenomenal lecture. And so we really appreciate your time here, and hopefully you can take some rest after this. I can see that we have no questions in the question tab. So I'll just, on behalf of the conference and all of our attendees, I'll just say thank you.
All right, well, thank you. Should I now stop sharing the screen then?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Take care.